Good evening. This is Lawrence Holgate, the host of Understanding Plato and the author of the book, the textbook or the study guide called Understanding Plato. It is part of the Smart Students' Guides to the Classical Philosophers. And this is episode 16 of the podcast. We are coming to the end of Book 4 of Plato's Republic. In the previous episode, 15, I introduced listeners to the Humunculus Problem. It's a problem that arises from Plato's theory that the soul has parts. Specifically, it has three parts: the appetitive part, the passions, and reason. And these parts often come into conflict with each other. This is where the problem happens with the three-part soul of the soul. This is where Julius Annus, who invented the idea or the problem called the Humunculus Problem, says that Plato comes into specific trouble. And it happens, the problem happens when we try and take control of ourselves, of our appetites, for example, or when we try to take control of our passions or desires. For example, anger is the one that specifically that Plato talks about. Plato's character Socrates says that each part of the soul has its own unique desires and pleasures. And this is what I talked about at the end of episode 15. For example, I was the recovering alcoholic who says that he has a strong urge to continue drinking. And when he does that, he's reporting a desire of the appetitive part of the soul. And when he tells us at the same time that he doesn't want to drink alcohol, he says, for example, I am recovering, he's reporting a desire of the rational part of his soul. And this characterization implies that each part of the soul is itself a type of person, an invisible person, which Julius Annus called the Humunculus. This invisible person resides in the soul, and it battles with other parts of the soul about dominance. But what I pointed out in episode 15 at the end, if each part of the soul is itself a kind of person, then wouldn't these sub-persons also have souls with parts and so on, infinitum? Finding the answer to this question is called the Humunculus Problem, developed by Julius Annus in 1981 in her wonderful introduction to Plato's Republic. Now, it might be questioned whether we need a philosophical theory to explain the phenomenon of self-control and other cases in which we have conflicting desires. And if you ask me what I know about self-control, I think I would reply with an example. I would say, although I'm on a weight loss diet, sometimes I get very hungry and I want to eat more than I should. And in these situations, I need to exercise some self-control. I do this by distracting myself. I try activities that will not remind me of food. With reference to this example, and others like it, one might claim that, well, this is all that anyone needs to know about self-control. I know how to use the word self-control in the correct circumstances, and my friends understand me when I tell them my weight loss story. What more is there to know? Why do we need a theory? Well, Socrates says that we need a theory because we need to explain the problematic phenomenon of conflicting desires. And it's problematic because Socrates claims to not understand how one and the same person can control himself. How can the person controlled be identical to the person who's doing the controlling? But hasn't this been explained by the example I just gave you? If you press me about how I was able to control what I eat, I would answer by saying that I have several strategies. I distract myself by engaging in activities that take my mind off the topic of food. I drink lots of water. I eat small amounts of low-calorie foods during the day. I exercise, and so on. Another example. Consider an all too familiar case of a recovering alcoholic who does not want to imbibe because she wants to remain sober. But at the same time, she admits that she wants to drink because she craves the alcoholic high. The reasons she gives show that each of her desires is for a different end, although she must make a choice between satisfying her craving for alcohol and wanting to remain sober. Between these two things, between her craving and her desire to remain sober, the resolution of her internal conflict is to be found in the reasons that she gives for either drinking or not drinking. She might also discuss several strategies for controlling her craving for alcohol. For example, that she goes to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at the time of day when the urge to drink is the strongest. In sum, there is no need to invent an apparatus of parts of the soul to explain how she made her choice. And if we do adopt Plato's apparatus, then we open the door again to the Humunculus problem, which I said can drive you crazy. That is, drive you crazy because you're going to have to start explaining how each part of the soul operates. And why don't they have their own homunculi to taunt them? Now, it might be argued that although the resolution of the alcoholic's conflict might be found in the reasons she gives for drinking or not drinking, the origin of the conflict is not found in reasons. The origin is to be found in the strong desire to imbibe and the equally strong desire to stop drinking. And that's where the principle of opposites is most effective in presenting Socrates' puzzle. How can these opposing desires exist in one and the same soul, he says? But the reply to this question is the same as stated just recently. Look to the reasons that the person gives, that this woman, the alcoholic, gives, or would give for the desire and for the aversion. She wants to drink because it will make her drunk and happy, at least for a while. She does not want to drink because she knows that if she continues, she will lose her job, her health, her family, and probably die a painful death of liver disease. Perhaps Plato was seduced by a model that he imported from Socrates' account of a city divided into 3 classes of inhabitants, each class having its own job or task. When there's an internal conflict in the city about who should control the conduct of the city, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that this is a conflict between discrete and identifiable classes in the city. For example, the guardian class and the money-making or the wage-earning classes. Plato appeals to this model when he looks at the, quote, problem of an individual who exercises self-control. In other words, he's using the city as a model to discuss the problem of an individual who exercises or fails to exercise self-control. If the correct analysis of the statement, quote, the city has an internal conflict about who should rule, if the analysis of that means some classes of the city are in conflict with other classes about who is to rule, then Plato assumes that this is also the correct analysis of, quote, Jane has an internal conflict about whether she should drink alcohol. In other words, when he says Jane has an internal conflict about whether she should drink alcohol, he's depending upon the model that the city has an internal conflict about who should rule. And this gets him in trouble. The latter, about Jane, he wants to say, should also be analyzed, as he did with the city, as some part of Jane's soul is in conflict with another part of her soul, in the same way that some part of the city, for example, the wage earners, is in conflict with another part of the city, namely the rulers. Although Plato cannot observe or otherwise experience these parts, he assumes that they must exist because the model of the divided city gave him a way to solve the self-created puzzle of individual self-control. I think this discussion shows that there might be a second way. Well, it's something to think about, and I want you to think about the Humunculus problem. If you want, take a look, go to the library, get a copy of Julia Annis's book on Plato's Republic. Take a look what she says, and see if you can come up with something different. Let's move on to the rest of Book 4 of Plato's Republic. Socrates concludes his lengthy discussion of justice, wisdom, courage and temperance, with the pronouncement that these virtues in the individual are nearly the same as they are in the city. The only difference between them is the source of the named activity. The source of a virtue in the city is either a particular class of the city, or it is in a relationship between the classes. That's where you'll find the virtue. Either in the city as a particular class, the virtue of a particular class, or the virtue of a relationship between classes. The source of a virtue in the individual is also either in a particular part of the soul, or it is in a relationship between its parts. Here we go with using the model of the city to describe what happens in the soul. For example, wisdom in the city is to be found in the ruling class of complete guardians, and courage is to be found in the auxiliaries, the soldiers, who fight and obey the commands of the guardians. By analogy, wisdom in the individual person is to be found in the rational part of the soul, and courage is to be found in the spirited part. Plato says it does this by preserving through pain and pleasure the pronouncements of reason about what should inspire terror and what should not. That's Republic, paragraph 442c, that quote. The virtues of temperance and justice are to be found in the way in which the classes or parts relate to one another. For example, temperance in the city exists in the city when the rulers and the subjects share the same belief that the better class, the guardians, should rule. Temperance in an individual exists when all three parts of her soul share the belief that the rationally calculating element should rule and do not engage in faction against it. Paragraph 442c through d. And now we finally arrive at the definition of justice in the individual. Socrates had previously described justice in the city as a condition in which each person in the city, or each class in the city, is doing its own work, the work for which he or the class is naturally suited. By analogy, justice in an individual exists when each part of the soul is doing the work for which it is naturally suited. And, quote, each element within the soul does its own job where ruling and being ruled are concerned. Again, look what's happening. In order to describe the virtue of justice in the city, or a justice in the soul, he refers back to the model of justice in the city. Socrates is not going to let his argument stand on the basis of a single analogy, though. He does give one more proof by applying an everyday test for his definition. And the test is to ask Glaucon whether a person with justice in his or her soul would embezzle gold or silver that he had accepted for deposit. This is his example. Would a person with justice in his soul embezzle anything, embezzle gold or silver from the city? Or embezzle the gold or silver that he had accepted for deposit? Would he engage in robberies, like robberies of the Athenian temples? Would he do thefts? Would he betray his friends in private life? Would this person be untrustworthy when it comes to promises or other agreements? Or would he be the sort of person who commits adultery, showing disrespect for parents or neglect of the gods? And Glaucon replies immediately that although another sort of person would do such things, certainly this person, the person with justice in the soul, would refrain from these activities. He would not embezzle gold or silver. He would not rob the temples. He would not betray his friends in private life. He would not betray the city. He would be trustworthy, not untrustworthy. He would keep his agreements. He would not show disrespect for his parents. He would respect his parents. And Socrates adds the remark that the reason that this person would not commit these unjust acts is that he has justice in his soul. Now, this argument is open to question. Why should we agree that a person with the kind of soul that Socrates refers to as just is incapable of doing the unjust or wrongful acts that we previously described. So what we're going to talk about now in this conclusion is justice in the soul, injustice in the soul, just or right actions, unjust or wrong actions. Okay, justice in the soul, injustice in the soul, just actions, unjust actions. Or if you like the word right actions and wrong actions, this is equivalent to just and unjust actions. So consider the proposition that if a person has justice in the soul, then that person will never do an unjust act. If a person has justice in the soul, then that person will never do an unjust act. If this is an analytic proposition, that is, then it should be a logical contradiction to claim that a person has justice in the soul, but he will never do an unjust act. Imagine a person who is very intelligent, has the same appetites as the rest of us, for example, hunger and thirst, and sometimes this person gets angry. She spends a month devising a plot to rob a bank. She carries out the crime and leaves no trace of her presence. She has guided the non-rational parts of her soul in creating and executing her plot. She doesn't let her biological appetites or her propensity to get angry control her. She remains cool and calculating when she robs the bank. Well, in her case, justice in the soul doesn't prevent her from committing an unjust act. One problem is that we do not know what considerations will figure into the calculations that are made by a just person. Is this person guided by a set of moral rules that prohibit theft? Does he or she aspire to a moral standard that tells her that good people don't steal the property of others? And if she does know about such rules and standards, does possession of this knowledge guarantee that she will behave accordingly? Socrates doesn't answer these questions until much later in books 9 and 10 of the Republic. He understands that there are gaps in this account. In particular, he must explain the relation between reason, knowledge, belief, and their objects. And only then will he be able to tell us how knowledge of justice can inform and motivate a just act. I think this is a serious problem for all of us, by the way. It's not just a Platonic problem, a problem of Plato. We've got to make this link between what we know about what is right and our motivation to do what is right. There's a gap here. Is it true that a person who knows what justice is always going to be motivated to do a just act? Does that sound right to you? Is that correct? Do you have any counterexamples? I just gave you one, by the way. So let's talk about injustice in the soul. It's identical to injustice in the city, according to Plato. It arises when there is a meddling of one part of the soul with that of another part. And this happens when the non-rational appetitive part of the soul rebels, quote, against the whole in order to rule it inappropriately, since its nature suits it to be the slave of the ruling class. The disorder and wandering of this part of the soul is injustice. It's licentiousness, cowardice, ignorance. And in a word, it's the whole of vice, Socrates says. The implication is that if a person is entirely governed by the appetitive part of the soul, then this will inevitably lead to acts of injustice, and the unjust behavior will be symptomatic of the disorder of her soul. This theory of the relationship between injustice in the soul and unjust behavior seems to conflict with the earlier claim of Glaucon, which was not disputed by Socrates, that an unjust person will sometimes refrain from committing unjust acts whenever he or she believes that they might be seen by others, thereby risking a loss of reputation. So you can have a really bad person refrain from doing the unjust acts that he wants to do, but he wants to do this in hiding. He doesn't want other people to see him because he doesn't want to lose his reputation in the community. This implies an ability of an unjust person to rationally control his behavior in order to satisfy a particular appetite. And if they can rationally control their appetites in order to protect their reputation, then they should also be able to control them in all situations, including those in which they perceive no threat to their reputation. Consider again the case of the self-controlled bank robber that I gave you earlier. Socrates concludes with a description of healthy and unhealthy actions in the body and in the soul. He says, quote, "Healthy actions engender health. Unhealthy actions engender one's disease." He attributes the production of health to elements in the body that are in their natural relations of mastering and being mastered by one another. The production of disease is produced by the establishment in the body of a relation of ruling and being ruled by one another that is contrary to nature. Socrates doesn't identify these bodily elements or explain how he knows that some of them have a natural relation to others of either ruling or being ruled. Socrates then draws an analogy with just and unjust actions. He says these actions have the same effect on the soul that healthy and unhealthy actions are said to have in the body. They establish the elements in the soul in a natural relation of mastering and being mastered by one another, while to produce injustice is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled by one another that is contrary to nature. Paragraph 444D in Republic. Socrates has already told us the names of the parts of the soul that are in the relationship of either ruling or being ruled. What he has not told us is how it is that just actions produce the desired relationship of mastering and being mastered, and how injustice produces the opposite. Now, although the analogy is incomplete, Socrates identifies virtue with health, and he identifies vice with shameful disease and wickedness, making an analogy between mind and body. Having done this, he makes the final step. If the conditions of being just and unjust are as described, then it is clearly more profitable to do just actions, engage in fine practices, and be just, than to do injustice and be unjust. And Socrates means by this that justice is always more profitable than injustice, even in those cases imagined earlier by Glaucon, in which the just person exchanged reputations with the unjust person and is subsequently executed on false charges. And the unjust person who has a reputation for justice is no better for it. Even if one could do whatever one wished, it could not be worth living when the natural constitution of the very thing by which we live is ruined and in turmoil. That's a quote from paragraph 445b, Republic. I'll repeat that. Socrates says, even if one could do whatever one wished, it could not be worth living when the natural constitution of the very thing by which we live is ruined and in turmoil. Socrates has much more to say about the soul of the unjust man, but a series of digressions on other topics prevents him from coming back to this discussion until Book 9. That's enough for today. I see I've gone over time, but Book 4 is really consequential. It's really important to go over time and time and time again to get a full inkling of what Socrates is doing. And that's about it for me. We'll see you on the other side next Monday. Bye-bye.